Imagine the streets of Rome alive with the roar of celebration, banners snapping in the warm Mediterranean wind, and the smell of roasted meats and sweet wine filling the air. The tyrannical shadow of Tiberius had finally lifted, and the city's heart pulsed with relief and anticipation. Into this scene steps a young man, barely more than a boy in the eyes of the world, yet carrying the weight of centuries in his bloodline. Gaius Caesar, known to those around him as Caligula, the Little Boot, was the new emperor, and Rome, for the moment, could almost believe in miracles again. From the first day of his reign, Caligula's charisma was palpable. He rode through the streets on a gleaming white horse, waving to the crowds who pressed eagerly against the marble balconies. Coins were thrown from palace windows. Feasts were held in the forum. He spoke with a warmth that seemed to promise everything Rome had long forgotten: justice, generosity, and glory. Children laughed in the sunlight, and even the once fearful merchants dared to dream of prosperity. The Senate, those gray-robed men of power and caution, whispered among themselves in wary excitement. Could this young heir be the savior of the Republic? Or was this all a brilliant illusion, a fleeting mirage that would soon vanish like morning mist? Behind the spectacle, though, small details began to capture attention. Caligula remembered names, not just of senators, but of the lowly street vendors, the soldiers who marched beneath the standards, the widows and orphans who often went unnoticed. His gestures seemed almost effortless, a nod here, a gracious smile there, but they were calculated, magnetic. People began to feel, almost instinctively, that he was more than human, that some ancient golden blood pulsed beneath his skin. And yet, even in this seemingly perfect beginning, a shadow lingered. Whispers of past horrors under Tiberius still haunted the corners of Rome. Senators exchanged glances as if testing whether this young emperor's kindness would last, or if it would bend to ambition, pride, or, dare they think it, madness. For now, however, those doubts were buried beneath the overwhelming thrill of hope. The city celebrated a golden dawn, and in the palace, Caligula allowed himself a secret smile. He knew the stage was set, the people loved him, the Senate feared him, and he had only just begun to play the part of the emperor Rome would never forget. The initial joy of Caligula's reign had painted Rome in brilliant colors: golden banners, laughter echoing in the forums, and music spilling from every corner of the city. But behind the palace doors, shadows began to gather, stretching long and strange across the marbled halls. At first, the oddities were subtle: a servant missing from his quarters, a nobleman quietly recalled to the palace under mysterious pretense, a feast that stretched long into the night with laughter that sometimes curdled into uncomfortable silence. Those who had celebrated the young emperor now began to murmur in quiet corridors. The golden heir who had promised hope began to show flashes of something else: unpredictability, capriciousness, and a glimmer of cruelty. A lavish banquet intended to honor a visiting dignitary would suddenly twist into a theater of fear, where jesters and senators alike played parts they had not consented to. Some guests would leave in tears, others would never leave at all. The city, so recently awash in sunlight, felt the first tremors of unease. Reports trickled into the streets: a senator gone missing, a merchant's fortune quietly confiscated, an entire household left empty without explanation. Yet nothing was ever confirmed. In Rome, rumors were as dangerous as swords, and whispers of the emperor's strange whims began to ripple through every corner of the empire. Inside the palace, the young emperor's brilliance and charm remained undeniable. He could charm the Senate with a single smile, flatter the soldiers with a well-chosen phrase, and delight the citizens with public games that were both grand and intoxicating. But behind that charm lay a growing unpredictability. Sometimes he would appear suddenly at midnight, wandering the halls in elaborate robes and speaking to shadows as though they were courtiers. Sometimes he would laugh at tragedies, sometimes weep at trivialities. The line between brilliance and madness was growing thinner by the hour, and no one, not even the most trusted advisors, could read him with certainty. Yet, amid this unsettling behavior, Caligula continued to play his role perfectly in public. The crowds loved him still, seeing only the generosity, the games, the promises of a new golden age. But behind closed doors, Rome's elite began to understand a dangerous truth. The golden heir was not merely a figure of charm and light. Something darker was stirring, and the palace that had once promised security now seemed a place where the shadows moved on their own, where even the familiar could not be trusted. By the time the first truly frightening rumors reached the streets, the missing men, the sudden arrests, the whispers of cruelty disguised as whimsy, the city realized that Caligula's mask had slipped. And with that slip, the people caught the first glimpse of a ruler who might be far more dangerous than any tyrant Rome had seen. Imagine the streets of Rome again, but now with a new kind of awe and unease. The same young emperor who once inspired cheers and laughter now walks with an almost unearthly presence. Caligula, the boy who had captured hearts with his warmth, had begun to blur the line between man and deity. Statues of gods seemed to bow beneath his shadow. Temples, once filled with humble worshippers, now felt the weight of his gaze. And he did not bow. He did not kneel. He expected to be worshipped. Caligula's proclamations shook the foundations of tradition. He declared himself divine, a living god among mortals, a being whose will was not only law, but sacred law. Priests, once unquestioned arbiters of Rome's spiritual life, were made to serve him directly, offering incense and prayers not to Jupiter, but to the emperor himself. Citizens murmured in fear and fascination. Some wept at the sight, overcome with awe. Others whispered darkly, questioning whether Rome had gone mad or if its emperor truly had. The transformation was not merely ceremonial, it was deeply personal. Caligula entered temples not to pray, but to inspect, to judge, to claim. He would walk through the forum with an air of divinity, sandals touching the stones as if the earth itself must recognize him. When a citizen dared to look away, the emperor's eyes, sharp and piercing, seemed to measure the soul. Those who met his gaze felt a thrill of admiration, but also a chill, as if the line between worship and terror had vanished. Yet, despite this godlike aura, human quirks remained. Caligula laughed, sometimes at his own grand pronouncements, sometimes at the absurdity of mortal fear. He held feasts where he entertained not only with music and wine, but with riddles and riddles of cruelty, testing the limits of loyalty and courage among senators and courtiers alike. The spectacle was mesmerizing and terrifying. Rome watched, spellbound, as the boy emperor became something more, something beyond comprehension. And then came the subtle, terrifying shifts. He began to speak to the gods as if they were his equals, or perhaps his servants, challenging omens, rewriting rituals, and mocking tradition with a sly, dangerous grin. Citizens began to notice a pattern. What appeared as madness was deliberate, a performance so convincing that no one could tell where divinity ended and human will began. The young emperor's rise was no longer just political, it was spiritual, psychological, and terrifyingly theatrical. Rome gasped at this transformation. Some were enthralled, kneeling in devotion. Others were gripped by fear, whispering prayers for mercy that might never come. And at the center of it all, Caligula stood tall, radiant and terrifying, Rome's first emperor who demanded not only loyalty, but worship, and who would not be denied. Picture Rome as a city alive with splendor, yet now under the shadow of uncertainty. The people still admired Caligula, still whispered his name in awe, yet behind the brilliant spectacles, a darker reality began to emerge. Wealth, once thought secure in the hands of noble families and sacred temples, started to disappear. Estates that had been passed down for generations were seized without warning. Treasuries, filled to the brim with gold, silver, and precious artifacts, were suddenly emptied under the emperor's orders. And no one, not even the wealthiest patricians, could say why. Families that had once basked in favor now begged for mercy. Fathers who had toasted Caligula at public games trembled in their private homes. Mothers whispered warnings to children who barely understood the danger lurking in their very walls. Rome was learning that generosity from the emperor came with a price, one that could vanish overnight, leaving ruin in its wake. Caligula's methods were theatrical, almost ritualistic. He would summon a wealthy senator to the palace under the pretense of honor and celebration, only to announce that his fortune was to become a gift to the state, or, sometimes, to fund a lavish festival of the emperor's design. Coins clinked into the coffers while families watched helplessly, their lives rearranged by whim and fear. It was a spectacle, a performance, and a warning all at once. Yet, for all the horror, the young emperor retained an almost mesmerizing charm. When questioned, he would smile, even laugh, explaining that the state must thrive, that Rome's greatness depended on his vision. His reasoning was as compelling as it was terrifying. No one dared oppose him openly. Senators and citizens alike began to understand that Caligula's whims were not simple madness. They were power, wielded with precision. Even the priests and temple guardians felt the shift. Sacred treasures, meant to honor gods older than Rome itself, were redirected for imperial use. Rituals continued, but now they served a different master. The people noticed, silently questioning whether devotion to the gods was still meaningful, or whether it had been replaced by devotion to the emperor alone. The city, dazzled and frightened, realized that Caligula's generosity had a dark twin: unpredictability. Rome's golden heir, the boy emperor who once promised joy and hope, now revealed a side that was both brilliant and terrifying. One could never tell whether an act was an extravagant gift or a calculated act of domination. The line between love and fear blurred, and the citizens understood that, under Caligula, fortunes could vanish as quickly as a candle's flame. And so, Rome watched, enthralled and anxious, as the emperor turned wealth itself into theater, leaving families desperate, the city uneasy, and the empire teetering on the edge of a new and frightening reality. Picture the city of Rome, a place accustomed to grandeur, to spectacles of power and wealth, but now faced with an event that no one could have imagined. In the heart of the empire, the young emperor Caligula, already feared and admired for his brilliance and unpredictability, unveiled a decree so bizarre that it sent ripples of shock through the Senate, the streets, and even the temples themselves. His beloved horse, Incitatus, was to be elevated to priesthood, a sacred, honored position, equal in ceremony to the most venerated religious leaders of Rome. The citizens could hardly believe their ears. Statues of gods had been challenged, wealth had vanished, but never had an animal, no matter how noble, been granted such a role. Courtiers whispered in disbelief. Senators stifled horrified laughter behind their robes. And yet, the emperor delivered the proclamation with a calm, almost regal air, as though it were the most natural of acts. Incitatus, a horse already renowned for his beauty and strength, became the center of imperial attention. His stall was fitted with ivory mangers, purple blankets, and golden harnesses. Guests were expected to honor him in ceremonies, to bow before him in a performance of loyalty and reverence. The spectacle was absurd, yes, but it was also deliberate. Caligula, ever the theatrical ruler, seemed to be sending a message. The Senate, the so-called guardians of Rome's traditions, were no longer the ultimate authority. The emperor's will, his whim, and his vision were supreme. And there was something deeply unsettling in this act. The horse, though innocent and unaware, became a mirror reflecting the absurdity, fear, and helplessness of Rome's elite. Senators who had once wielded influence now felt powerless. Even the most cautious courtiers could not refuse the emperor's bizarre command without risking their lives. The elevation of Incitatus was not merely eccentricity. It was a demonstration, a warning wrapped in theatrical brilliance. The citizens, hearing rumors of the decree, were divided between amusement and terror. Street vendors joked nervously. Children laughed at the thought of a horse in priestly robes, but the laughter carried unease. Rome was learning that under Caligula, no tradition, no expectation, and no limit of propriety could stand unchallenged. The emperor's imagination and his power knew no bounds. Yet behind this audacious act lay another layer, visible only to those paying careful attention. Was it madness? Or was it strategy? Caligula seemed to understand the fragile balance between fear and loyalty. By elevating his horse, he mocked the Senate, humiliated the powerful, and reminded everyone that the emperor was a force beyond comprehension. Rome watched, mesmerized, uneasy, and aware that the theater of power had reached a new, terrifying peak. And so, the city learned a chilling lesson. Under Caligula, even a horse could command reverence, and the cost of dissent could be deadly. Imagine stepping into the heart of the Roman palace, where marble floors gleam under flickering torchlight and the air is thick with the scent of incense, wine, and something less tangible? Caligula, the young emperor who had already astonished Rome with his charm, divine claims, and shocking decrees, now transformed governance itself into theater. Every meeting, every decree, every audience with the Senate was a performance, and the stakes were life and death. No one could predict the next act. Senators were summoned not just to advise, but to participate, as if Rome itself were a stage, and they were unwilling actors in a play scripted by a master of cruelty. A senator might be praised in public one day, only to be exiled the next for a minor misstep, a misword, or an imperceptible expression of doubt. Courtiers learned quickly that silence was safer than speech, yet even silence could be misread. In Caligula's theater, the ordinary rules of caution no longer applied. The emperor delighted in displays that were both brilliant and terrifying. He staged games where the audience witnessed not just athletic contests, but subtle exercises of power, where rivals were humiliated, fortunes vanished, and loyalty was tested before thousands of watching eyes. A public feast might begin with music and wine, but end in whispers of exile and veiled threats. Rome became both the audience and the victim of a drama that no one could leave, a performance so consuming that it blurred the line between admiration and terror. Inside the palace, tension crackled like electricity. Courtiers exchanged glances, trying to read the mood, to anticipate the next move, but Caligula's mind remained a labyrinth. His laughter, sharp and sudden, could transform a calm audience into a quivering one. He demanded perfection in performance, whether in ritual, debate, or obedience, and the price of failure was high. Yet, paradoxically, this cruelty was paired with moments of generosity, moments that drew the city to his side and made it impossible to separate fear from fascination. Even the streets outside felt the ripple of his performances. Citizens spoke in hushed tones of strange rituals, lavish spectacles, and sudden disappearances. Tales of what happened within the palace walls spread like wildfire. Stories of senators kneeling in ceremonial shame, of musicians trembling before the emperor, of courtiers forced to enact bizarre games of loyalty. Every story, every rumor, served to reinforce the emperor's power and the terrifying reach of his imagination. By turning governance into theater, Caligula achieved something remarkable: absolute control over perception. Rome's citizens, senators, and soldiers all became actors in a grand drama, orchestrated by an unpredictable, mercurial leader. And while the city marveled, it also shivered. In this new world, where rules were rewritten daily and loyalty was currency, one truth became chillingly clear. Under Caligula, the stage of Rome belonged entirely to the emperor, and no one dared step out of line. Step inside the palace, away from the cheering crowds and the dazzling spectacles, and you enter a very different Rome. Here, shadows stretch across marble corridors, and the flickering torchlight seems to play tricks on the eyes. Within these walls, even Caligula's closest family felt the chill of fear. Fear not of foreign armies, not of political rivals outside the city, but of the emperor himself. Caligula's charisma, once comforting, had evolved into something unpredictable and dangerous. Siblings who had grown up playing in the gardens of their youth now tiptoed through hallways, aware that a misstep could cost them everything. Wives whispered to each other in hushed tones, sharing anxious glances that betrayed the constant tension of living under a man who could shift from warmth to fury in an instant. Courtiers who once smiled at every joke and bowed at every greeting learned quickly that smiles could be misinterpreted as mockery and silence could be seen as plotting. Plots and betrayals began to simmer beneath the palace's glittering surface. The emperor's inner circle, once bound by loyalty and family ties, now moved cautiously, balancing ambition with survival. A hand extended too eagerly, a word spoken too freely, or a glance in the wrong direction could be fatal. Even trusted allies, those who had stood beside Caligula through the rise to power, began to question whether loyalty was worth the cost. And yet, Caligula's brilliance made it nearly impossible to act against him. Every room in the palace was a stage, every interaction a test. The emperor seemed to see all things, to anticipate every thought and hesitation. Courtiers who thought themselves clever found that their schemes were anticipated and subtly manipulated, turning their own ambitions against them. Fear was no longer an occasional presence. It was woven into the very fabric of life within the palace. But the fear wasn't only outward. Even Caligula himself seemed to play with it, as if he understood that terror could be an instrument as sharp as any sword. Moments of laughter and generosity were carefully measured against sudden punishments, disappearing friends, and whispered rumors of exile. The emperor's family, torn between love, duty, and survival, realized that no one was safe, not even those closest to him. Outside the palace, Rome remained unaware of the tension lurking behind the opulent walls. The city marveled at games, processions, and feasts, unaware that the emperor's home was a place where loyalty was tested in silence, where every shadow might conceal betrayal, and where fear had become the most powerful force of all. In the palace, the golden heir had become a master of psychological theater. And in that theater, even the closest family and allies had to perform, lest they find themselves cast out, or worse. Rome's brilliant young emperor had made the ultimate discovery. Fear could rule as effectively as love, and no one, not blood, not loyalty, not tradition, could stand in its way. By now, the people of Rome had grown accustomed to the unpredictable brilliance of their young emperor. Tales of lavish feasts, divine proclamations, and even the peculiar elevation of his horse had become part of the city's collective memory. Yet beneath the spectacle, a question began to ripple through whispered conversations in the forum and shadowed corridors of the palace. Was Caligula truly insane, or was his madness merely an illusion? It was a dangerous question, one that no one dared voice aloud, but for those close to the emperor, the senators, the courtiers, and even members of his own family, the signs were impossible to ignore. Every act that seemed irrational, every whim that appeared cruel, every sudden change in mood might have been carefully calculated. Every scream of anger or outburst of laughter could be a piece of a larger, invisible puzzle. Caligula's intelligence, long hidden beneath charm and charisma, became increasingly apparent. His public theatrics, his mercurial decisions, even the fear he inspired, these were not the hallmarks of madness, but of strategy. Each cruel spectacle forced obedience, tested loyalty, and reminded Rome's elite that the emperor controlled not just power, but perception itself. What looked like chaos from the outside was, in fact, a meticulously orchestrated performance, designed to keep the city and its leaders off balance, perpetually guessing, perpetually fearful. The emperor's inner circle began to notice patterns. Those who had dared to speak too freely, who had misjudged his intentions, or who had failed to anticipate the direction of his mind, found themselves exiled, humiliated, or worse. And yet, he would sometimes show surprising generosity, granting favor to an overlooked senator, forgiving a mistake, or appearing in public with a charm that reminded the city why they had once adored him. This duality only reinforced the sense of uncertainty. Was he mad, or was he playing everyone as pieces on a chessboard? Even the citizens, who saw only the surface, felt the tension without understanding it. The golden heir they had once cheered for now seemed to move with purpose, hidden behind apparent chaos. Rumors began to spread, not of insanity, but of a mind so cunning, so unpredictable, that it had become impossible to read. The emperor's brilliance and cruelty became inseparable, leaving everyone to wonder whether fear, reverence, or confusion was the most appropriate response. By this time, it was clear that Caligula's rule was not guided by whim alone. The madness the city whispered about was a mask, a performance so convincing that few could distinguish reality from strategy. Behind the laughter, the feasts, the divine proclamations, and even the shocking absurdities, the emperor remained terrifyingly in control. And the greatest twist of all was this: the city's leaders, the senators, and even his family were playing their parts perfectly, in a drama orchestrated by a mind far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. By now, even the bravest senators could no longer deny the dangerous brilliance of Caligula. The emperor, once celebrated as Rome's golden heir, had become a figure both mesmerizing and terrifying. Behind the grand spectacles and divine proclamations, a quiet storm was brewing. The very men who had once cheered his rise, the senators, the architects of power, the so-called pillars of the Republic, now whispered in shadowed corridors, plotting the unthinkable, the downfall of the emperor. The conspiracy began in whispers. A flick of a robe, a glance exchanged across a banquet table, a silent nod in a dark hallway, all became part of a secret language of dissent. Senators who had once spoken openly now tiptoed, fearing that even a hint of criticism could be interpreted as treachery. The emperor had trained them well. Obedience was a survival skill, and misreading his intent could be deadly. Yet fear, while powerful, also breeds daring. A handful of the most ambitious and desperate men began to draw lines in the sand. Their plans were careful, calculated, and clandestine. Each dagger, metaphorical or literal, was hidden behind smiles and handshakes. Every loyal gesture, every public bow, masked intentions that could alter the course of the empire. In the echoing halls of the Senate, old rivalries resurfaced, alliances shifted like sand, and a dangerous game began to unfold, one in which the stakes were life itself. Caligula, however, remained a step ahead. Or so it seemed. Rumors spread that he could sense the currents of conspiracy, that his uncanny insight and unpredictability made it impossible to hide true intentions. Every meeting, every audience with the senator was a test. Every word spoken or withheld, every action taken or omitted was noted and weighed. To move against him required not only courage but cunning, and even the most brilliant minds hesitated, knowing that a single misstep could bring swift, brutal retribution. Outside the Senate walls, Rome continued to cheer for the emperor, oblivious to the tension simmering behind closed doors. Yet within the palace and the council chambers, fear and ambition collided. The conspirators knew that if they failed, exile or death awaited. And if they succeeded, the course of history itself would be rewritten in a single bloody stroke. This was the dangerous, thrilling, and terrifying climax of political theater. Rome, the city that had once celebrated the golden heir, now became a chessboard of whispers, hidden daggers, and secret loyalties. And at the center of it all, Caligula remained the puppet master, challenging the bold, unnerving the cautious, and turning the machinery of conspiracy into a spectacle he might already anticipate. The stage was set for a reckoning, and the tension hung in the air like storm clouds over the forum. Rome waited, though it did not yet know that the final act was coming, one that would shock the city to its core. The night was thick with tension, the kind that presses down on the chest and turns every shadow into a threat. The streets of Rome were quieter than usual, the citizens unaware that the city's fate was about to be rewritten. Inside the palace, whispers had become action. The conspirators, long plotting in shadowed corridors and behind closed doors, finally moved, their hearts pounding with fear, anticipation, and the weight of history. Each dagger concealed behind robes, each footstep measured, every breath a prayer. Caligula, as ever, seemed almost untouchable. His brilliance and unpredictability had kept Rome's elite off balance for years. No one had ever been able to read him fully. The golden heir who had charmed crowds, humiliated senators, elevated his horse, and declared himself divine, now faced a threat that even his cunning might not foresee. Yet even in the moments before chaos, he carried himself with the air of a god, as if daring the city and its conspirators to challenge him. The attack was swift and brutal. In the narrow, torch-lit corridors of the palace, daggers flashed, and cries echoed against marble walls. The conspirators, driven by desperation and fear, struck with precision, but not without cost. Blood stained the floors, and the palace, once a stage for spectacle and terror, became a theater of carnage. Caligula's life ended in a storm of violence, the brilliant, unpredictable mind finally silenced. And yet, even in death, the emperor's story refused to conclude neatly. Rome was left with a chilling question, one that would haunt senators, citizens, and historians for centuries. Had they killed a lunatic, a tyrant consumed by madness and whim, or had they silenced a dangerous genius who had played his role too perfectly to survive? The line between brilliance and madness, power and performance, became impossible to distinguish. Scholars, philosophers, and ordinary Romans would debate the answer, but the uncertainty itself became part of Caligula's enduring legend. Outside the palace, life in Rome slowly resumed, yet the shadow of the emperor lingered. Citizens whispered of the spectacles, the divine proclamations, and the cruelty that had seemed inexplicable at the time. Families recounted stories of vanished fortunes, of public humiliations, and of the terror that had gripped the hearts of even the most powerful men. And in those stories, Caligula lived on, not as a man, but as an idea, the embodiment of unpredictability, fear, and the dizzying seduction of absolute power. In the end, the empire learned a lesson as harsh as it was unforgettable. Even a golden heir, beloved and feared, could fall. And yet, the memory of what he had built, his spectacles, his audacity, his theater of terror, remained. A reminder that the line between genius and madness is often as thin as a dagger's blade and just as sharp. Rome had survived the storm. But the story of Caligula, the emperor who became a god in his own eyes, would echo through history, leaving awe and unease in equal measure.